We're starting. So, Mr. Ambassador, thank you for joining us today. We know your hands are full with the ongoing crisis in Ukraine.
Happy to be here.
Ukrainian acting President Alexander Turchinov, while commenting on the operation against militants who seized government buildings, called it anti-terrorist operation. Would you agree with this definition of separatist terrorist?
Well, Natasha, I'm not sure it's terribly useful to get bogged down one way or another on different labels. It certainly looks like terrorism to me when you see reports that, for instance, at the SBU building in Luhansk, the structure's been wired with explosives. We don't have a lot of details in terms of the specifics, but there should be no doubt in anybody's mind, based on what's been available on social media, what we're seeing from the OSCE observers, their public and private reporting. In multiple cities across eastern Ukraine, these are heavily armed individuals using military tactics to take control of government facilities.
And what do you think might be the goal of this campaign? What is your estimation?
I think it's very hard to say. Certainly, there seems to be, from some of them, an intention to cause mass disorder, to keep the government in Kyiv off balance. This has been a period of significant progress for the government here in Kyiv. They reached an agreement on an important IMF package. Those reforms were moved through the Rada last week. There's also been progress on the political front, with presidential elections coming up on May 25th, and successful conventions of all the major political parties nominating the candidates, and a serious debate and a meaningful debate in Kyiv over questions of constitutional reform, how to advance the goals of greater local autonomy that Prime Minister Yatsenyuk has embraced, that the Maidan has embraced, and which many of the regions of Ukraine have embraced as a means to deepen democracy here. So what it looks to me, on balance, these military actions are intended to keep the government off balance and prevent the success of Ukraine's new democratic authorities.
But it seems that some officials in the eastern Ukraine cities are supportive of these attacks. So the country seems totally polarized. So why does the U.S. Not keeping neutrality in this situation when the country is, such divided in such a manner?
I think these reports, the sort of characterization of division, I think, is overdrawn. The United States supports the people of Ukraine. We support the right of the Ukrainian people to make their own choices about their political future. I would note, for instance, that the legitimately elected assembly in Donetsk was very quick to reject these militants who took charge of the Donetsk assembly building, of the administration building, and declared the People's Republic of Donbass. Important to remember, the Rada which sits today is the same Rada which sat under President Yanukovych. This is the legitimately elected democratic structure of Ukraine. And so those who are acting outside the legal framework, including the people, the armed militants and separatists who've seized now, I think, 8 or 10 different buildings across eastern Ukraine, they are the ones who are taking sides. They are the ones who are opposing the will of the Ukrainian people.
And what is your worst fear with regard to this tense situation when the buildings are seized and the ultimatum actually has passed already?
Well, I think the greatest fear, of course, is large-scale violence. The government has been very clear. Prime Minister Yatsenyuk on down have all been clear that they seek a political solution, that they are trying to de-escalate this crisis to work through democratic political mechanisms. But my fear is that there is greater violence. Again, you have people in cities across eastern Ukraine, some of them heavily armed with Russian weapons, including state-of-the-art sniper rifles, Russian inventory, automatic machine guns with grenade launchers. These are not peaceful protesters. This is an armed force. And I think there is a real risk that their actions could precipitate greater violence. And any bloodshed, of course, is something that the United States will oppose.
And do you think this meeting in Geneva on April 17 might be actually helpful if we take into account the gaps between sides now, the gaps between Russian position and the West, for example?
Well, I know that's certainly Secretary Kerry's intention. We are pursuing these talks with great seriousness. We have said from the very first days of this crisis, from the first days of the Russian invasion, that we do not believe that there's a military solution to this crisis, that it has to be solved through diplomacy. We've worked very hard to establish diplomatic off-ramps to give Russia the opportunity to address its legitimate interests in Ukraine, to build a solid foundation for a sustainable relationship between Moscow and Kyiv through a diplomatic process. But the onus for now is on Moscow. Russia created this crisis through its invasion of Crimea and now through the escalation of tensions in eastern Ukraine. And it's Russia which will have to make the decision to de-escalate the crisis.
And what is the official U.S. position toward the idea of federalization that is pushed pretty hard by the Russian authorities?
These are issues only for the Ukrainian people to decide. There is nobody in Moscow and nobody in Washington who should get to choose what the future structure of the Ukrainian government should be. I want to be very clear on that. These are issues that only the Ukrainian people can resolve. There's a process of constitutional reform which is underway today in the Rada. A commission has been formed. There are extensive public meetings that are taking place, including a public meeting today chaired by the Deputy Prime Minister, which will be looking at a series of proposals. Prime Minister Yatsenyuk was in Dnipropetrovsk and Donetsk on Friday, talking about his ambition to deepen democracy, to increase local autonomy, to give local authorities a greater say over budgetary and other local governance issues. But these are issues that are going to be decided only by the Ukrainian people. They are certainly not going to be a topic for negotiation over the heads of the Ukrainian people, as some have suggested.
Under the current circumstances in eastern Ukraine, what are the real chances for the orderly early elections on May 25th?
Well, I think everybody in Ukraine is expecting this to be an important election. Indeed, in many ways, perhaps the most important election in the history of independent Ukraine. I was in Odessa on Friday and had an opportunity to speak to political leaders there. I know they are all in that heavily Russian-speaking region looking forward to presidential elections. They expect the elections to be hotly contested. You have nearly 24 candidates representing the full spectrum of political opinion. So there's certainly no reason why the presidential election should not go ahead. We think it's important that it take place on May 25th as planned and as the political parties are planning for. And we expect that what is going to emerge from that, hopefully, will be a contest which is genuinely free and fair. You will have one of the largest OSCE observer missions in the history of the work that ODIHR does, the OSCE Election Monitoring Institution. In addition, we expect large political delegations from Europe, from the European Parliament, from the United States, from both the Democratic and Republican Party. This is all intended to build confidence in the elections and to demonstrate the
Russia's argument is that the current ruling elite basically contains extremists. So are there any figures that are of concern to you that you won't meet with them, for example?
No, well, let me say, first of all, I think a lot of what's been in the Russian media is a complete caricature. It's a cartoon in terms of describing who is part of this government. This is a government that represents a broad spectrum of political opinion. I know that many of my own friends in the Party of Regions, members of the Rada and others, they are going on with their political lives. So to somehow suggest that there are pogroms or that this is a fascist government, I think anybody who calls this a fascist government has not spent much time with Prime Minister Yatsenyuk or the other members of his cabinet. This is a broad-based government that is seeking to make changes and technical improvements in governance in Ukraine that are long overdue. The United States, you asked about radicalism. The United States has a long-standing position in being very clear on our concerns about any kind of anti-Semitism or religious intolerance, I think especially in Ukraine, given the uniquely tragic history that this country has had with the Nazis, with the Holocaust. Honoring that history is an important part of Ukraine's own national identity, and it's something that I know that all political leaders are sensitive to, including, I should note, Svoboda, which has played a relatively moderating role through the Maidan process. And says that it wishes to establish itself as a democratic European political party. We will encourage that development, but we will also be very clear on our concerns about any kind of radical or anti-Semitic rhetoric, whatever its origin.
Let's talk about the U.S. response to this crisis, because polls in the U.S. consistently show the majority of the Americans basically are against the U.S. intervention, yet some lawmakers on the Hill are calling for military aid to Ukraine, at least providing weapons, advice, training, share intelligence, etc. Is this on the table? I mean, is the Ukrainian government asking for it at all?
Let me say a couple of things. First of all, I have been impressed by the breadth of American official engagement here, especially from Congress, Republicans and Democrats. We've had a large number of congressional delegations here. They all bring the same message, which is that the American people are interested in Ukraine's success as a sovereign, independent, democratic, and European state. There's no debate on that in the United States at all. On the specific support that you alluded to, we are convinced, as I said, this is a crisis that has to be solved through diplomacy, not through military tools. So our assistance to the government can best be channeled through our economic support, which is substantial, and through our political and diplomatic support, our support for our elections, our support for Ukraine before the United Nations. That's where we can have the greatest positive impact. We have a long-standing and successful defense and security cooperation relationship with Ukraine. Ukraine has been an active participant in NATO operations and UN peacekeeping. I was honored on Friday when I was in Odessa to visit the Sagadachny, one of the Ukrainian ships that recently returned from a NATO anti-piracy mission off the coast of Somalia. And I was able to see the small craft and some of the communications gear that were on that ship, which were provided through American security assistance. But that's a relatively modest piece of our overall relationship. And again, for purposes of this crisis, our focus is political, diplomatic, and helping to get Ukraine healthy economically.
Taking the step back, how valid is the argument of separatists? Because, in the years leading to this so-called Russian spring, did the Ukrainian authorities, in your opinion, make any mistakes with its treatment of Russian population, for example, Russian language status, etc.?
I'll say a couple of things. First of all, it's striking to me, the issues that we've been talking about this afternoon, most of these were not even on the political agenda until after the invasion of Crimea. Questions of separatism, questions of national identity, questions of language. The story I always tell is on November 15th, when Ukraine played France in the World Cup qualifying match here in Kyiv. It was a fantastic occasion. The whole Olimpinski Stadium was full. The crowd cheering for the Ukrainian team, which won, by the way, played very well. But nobody was asking whether the goalkeeper, the strikers were from Eastern Ukraine or Western Ukraine or Dnipropetrovsk or Luhansk. It was irrelevant. It wasn't part of the national discussion here. There are issues having to do with long-term consolidation of democracy. And certainly I'll say when I was in Odessa, I heard a lot of complaints from local politicians about how President Yanukovych had concentrated authority in Kyiv, had weakened local autonomy, and had weakened democracy as a result of that. And indeed, a large part of the demand of the Maidan has been to deepen democracy, to increase local authority, to see that governors are directly elected, to give local legislators the authority they need. And I think that all of those changes are an important part of consolidating Ukraine's democratic transition, making Ukraine's democracy irreversible. But as I emphasized, these are decisions not to be made from or to be dictated from outside. These are decisions to be made by the Ukrainian people.
Well, speaking about democracy, there is a democracy and there is an energy reality. Right now it's spring, but some in Russia are saying, just wait until the winter comes. And with the energy leverage of Russia, Ukraine won't have much choice but to yield to Kremlin's will. So how fast can the US and the Western allies act to protect actually Ukraine from Russia's pressure on energy?
Well, I have said from my first days in Ukraine in August that one of my priorities is strengthening Ukraine's energy independence. That takes on additional urgency now that Moscow has begun to use energy pricing as a political and diplomatic tool. As I said earlier, Ukraine wants to have a normal relationship with Russia, relationship based on respect, on sovereignty. Ukraine is going to remain an important transit country for Russian energy exports, Russian gas exports to Europe, and Ukraine will continue to rely on Russia for a significant portion of its gas imports. But there's a great deal that Ukraine can do in terms of reverse flow from Europe, in terms of improved energy efficiency, in terms of diversification of sources of energy, in terms of the increased development of non-conventional and renewable energy sources, something that's a priority to Secretary Kerry and our government. So energy issues are absolutely central to Ukraine's strategic position, also to its economic competitiveness, which is why it's been a priority for me, because over the long term, we want to see a Ukraine that's on a more healthy economic footing.
Some Western sanctions were called in Russia laughable. They were also called counterproductive. So how effective they actually are?
Well, I would simply say, I think, first of all, it's much too early to assess the impact of these sanctions. These are quite significant. They were developed in close consultation with our European partners. And so there are real consequences. A price is being paid by those who have been responsible for the violation of Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity, those who were behind the most egregious abuses that took place under the Yanukovych government here in Kyiv, and those who have been responsible for the invasion of Crimea and now apparently eastern Ukraine through these asymmetric tactics. So I think it's far too simple to say no impact at all. If you look at the billions of dollars in capital flight that have taken place in Russia over the past month, if you look at the impact on the Russian stock and capital markets, it's clear that the markets do not welcome the political steps that Russia has taken. But again, our hope is that these sanctions can be reversed, and they will be reversed through the choices that Russia makes to stabilize its relationship with Ukraine, to reverse its illegal occupation of Crimea, and to put its relations with Ukraine and the whole neighborhood on a more healthy and sustainable footing.
Talking about the U.S. Role in this conflict, the Russian Foreign Ministry made recently some statement about illegal armed militias, some American contractor named Greystone involved in this conflict. Can you comment on that?
Well, I'll say two things. I mean, first of all, I would suggest talking to Greystone. But I think the idea that there are American mercenaries running around Ukraine is just silly at this point. There's no basis for these reports. Vice President Biden is supposed to arrive there on April 22nd. Well, what kind of message he's going to bring? Well, I wouldn't be a very good diplomat if I preempted what the vice president is going to say a week from now. But I'm confident that an important part of his message will be strong support for the Ukrainian people, strong support for the elections, which will happen on May 25th, strong support for the important economic and constitutional reforms that the Yatsenyuk government has set in place, and strong support for Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity at a moment of great testing. Mr. Ambassador, I wanted to ask you several questions about your personal experience there. Basically, you've been there, I think, less than a year. So for what kind of tenure did you plan when you were nominated for the ambassador in Kiev? Well, thanks for the question. I mean, it's obviously been a historic year for Ukraine. It's been exhausting for everybody here, I think, but also an incredible honor to be representing the United States at a time of such importance in shaping the identity and the direction of independent Ukraine. And to be representing the United States at a moment when we are trying to make clear our support for the will of the Ukrainian people. I don't think anybody could have predicted what's happened over the past few months. I think back to the meeting I had in President Yanukovych's office in mid-November when I first learned of the U-turn that was taking place in the association agreement with Europe. I think if you had predicted then that the result was going to be hundreds of thousands of people on the Maidan, I would have said you were crazy. And I don't think that there was anybody on February 21st, when President Yanukovych got onto his helicopters and fled Kyiv, I don't think there was anybody who predicted that a few days later Russia would invade Crimea. And after the invasion of Crimea, there weren't many people, I think, who would have anticipated that the same kind of asymmetric tactics would be displayed a few weeks later in this outburst of unrest across eastern Ukraine. So it's been an incredibly dynamic period in Ukraine's history, but it's also been a period where the United States, working closely with our European partners, has tried to signal our strongest possible support for what the Ukrainian people want.
I've noticed that you're also an avid Twitter user, and you're using basically live in the middle of the very serious crisis. So first of all, how does it help you in your work? And what are the guidelines? I mean, it's very easy to cross some red line because it's done so quickly.
Yeah, good question. I mean, first of all, I should say this was all an experiment. When I came here, I had worked in some other big countries, and I knew that one of my challenges in a country of 46 million Ukrainians was going to be to get outside of Kyiv, to establish channels of communication, and to understand what the Ukrainian people are thinking and doing. And so for me in the beginning, the social media stuff was a way to listen more effectively, to get out beyond the embassy walls, and especially to establish a conversation with some of Ukraine's young people who are always inspiring and who are doing some of the most interesting and important work in terms of building the long-term foundation for democracy here. So that's where it started. It was sort of an accident and an experiment, but it was something that I wanted to do. As the crisis has accelerated here during the Maidan and then the invasion of Crimea and now the crisis in eastern Ukraine, I found that social media has been an incredibly important source of insight into stories that are just moving way too fast for conventional media. The first reporting that I heard of the invasion of Crimea came from social media accounts, including Twitter from AP reporters on the scene in Simferopol when the Oblast Rada building was seized by what we now know were Russian special forces. Likewise, over the course of this weekend, a lot of the initial reporting, most of the initial reporting, came from some incredibly courageous Ukrainian and international social media users who've been documenting what's been happening, who've been putting out video, who've been putting out pictures. That's one of the reasons this is such a changed environment. In the old days, the sort of lies and misrepresentation that have been part of some of the diplomacy around this would have been easier to carry off. But now when you see the pictures, when you see the military formations taking over government buildings in the east, or for that matter in Crimea a few weeks ago, it becomes much harder. It's an illustration to me of how the world is being changed by this technology in a profoundly positive way, in a way that empowers individuals, in a way that builds connectivity. So I come to see it as an essential part of my diplomatic toolkit. Truth be told, I usually open up my Twitter account in the morning before I open my State Department email, because I know that's where I'm going to get the most current assessment of what's been happening, what happened in Washington, and oftentimes, sadly, on the ground here in Ukraine while I was asleep. So it's very much part of our toolkit. It doesn't take the place of face-to-face diplomacy. And in fact, one of the things I've been enjoying doing recently in recent travels is using some of these social media networks to then have face-to-face conversations and meet the people behind some of the different accounts that I've gotten to know over the course of my diplomatic career here in Ukraine. But I think it's part of the diplomatic toolkit at this point, and that will certainly remain the case.
And in terms of your personal security, privacy, after this phone call that you had with the Assistant Secretary Nuland that was leaked, publicized, are you basically assuming now that all your phone calls, all your communications might be monitored, for example, by Russians?
Well, I'm not going to comment on any alleged phone calls, but I'll certainly say in my business throughout my career, it's always the assumption that anything you say on an open telephone line is subject to monitoring. So I always try to be polite about it.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. Thank you for being with us today.
Great talking to you, and look forward to continuing the conversation.
Thank you.